Producers and you, the viewers, are protected may have to be decided by the Supreme Court of the United States. Robin Groth, ABC News, Hollywood.
The right to protect creative work is guaranteed in the Constitution, and there is a whole body of copyright law in the United States. But is technology moving so quickly now that the lawmakers can't keep up? We'll raise that question in a moment when we talk with an expert on copyright law and again with MCA President Sid Sheinberg and Jack Wayman, Vice President of the Electronics Industries Association. There are some complicated but important legal issues involved in the dispute over home videotape recording, and with us now in our Los Angeles bureau to help sort them out is Melville Nimmer, a professor of law at UCLA and an expert on copyright law. And joining us once again, Sid Sheinberg, President of the Music Corporation of America, MCA, and Jack Wayman, Senior Vice President of the Electronic Industries Association. Professor Nimmer, if you'd be good enough to help sort this out for us just a little bit and be gentle with those of us who are neither professors nor lawyers, can you, in simple language, explain what the issue at stake is here?
I think I can, Mr. Koppel. Essentially, there are two basic issues. The first is, does the individual in his home who uses his videotape recorder, by that act, commit an act of copyright infringement? And this recent court decision said, yes, that is an act of copyright infringement.
Is he therefore a criminal in the broadest sense of the word?
He is not a criminal. It's not a crime. It's only a civil liability. But may I go on to the second issue, which affects this first issue? The second issue is the seller of the machine, in this case Sony, what is called a contributing infringer by selling the mechanism whereby the infringement can occur? The court said yes to the second point too, and then there is a third point, namely, what is the remedy? What do you do about it? Ordinarily, when somebody wins in a copyright infringement action, he's entitled to a permanent injunction. But this time the court suggested to the lower court, instead of an injunction prohibiting further acts of this sort, instead of that, a royalty can be prescribed by the court as against the company, against Sony. And if Sony pays such a royalty, then the people in their homes are no longer infringers.
All right.
They automatically are made lawful.
Let me go to Mr. Sheinberg of MCA, and it was one of your companies, Mr. Sheinberg, Universal, that was a plaintiff in this action. Would that be satisfactory to you if, for example, Sony were to pay a royalty?
Well, in a perfect world, we obviously would like to preclude the existence of this particular product because we don't believe there's any real fair way for us to be compensated. The reality, however, is that we don't live in a perfect world, and we may have to accept, and indeed we are prepared to accept, a fair and reasonable royalty that would be shared in by all of those people who toil in the vineyards of making copyrighted property and would guarantee us some just compensation.
I don't want to get us into too complex an area, but if, for example, the royalties end up in the pool, and one of the contributors to the creative pool, let's say, is the producer who came up with Jaws, and the other one is the producer of some C-grade movie that no one really wants to see, how are you going to determine who gets what out of that pool?
Well, that's a complicated issue. I would say this. There is a procedure that exists right now in another area called the Copyright Royalty Tribunal. Some of the problems that are raised by the pool, they can resolve. Other problems would presumably have to be worked out by negotiation or, failing all else, by some type of tribunal that the law might establish.
All right.
In other words, just because the problem is a difficult one, in our judgment, that isn't a reason why the answer should be we're entitled to nothing.
Let me just ask you, I can see why you went after Sony. Sony, after all, is a giant in this industry, but why go after an individual, and why cloud the issue in what, in a certain sense, has raised or perhaps lowered this thing to a certain level of mockery where you go after someone in their own home?
The reasons for that are really in the realm of the law, and I frankly can't answer that for you.
I could.
But suffice it to say, we have no interest whatsoever in chopping down anybody's door and taking out anybody's Betamax from anybody's house.
All right, Mr. Nimmer, I think I heard you whispering gently there in the background that you thought you could answer it. Why did they go after it?
Yes. In order to hold Sony liable as what is called a contributory infringer, you cannot be a contributory infringer. You cannot contribute to the infringement unless, in the first instance, there is an infringement, a primary infringement. The primary infringement is the individual in the home. Unless that is first established, you cannot go to the second step and find Sony also liable as a contributory infringer.
All right, Mr. Wayman, let me go to you for a moment. What has been suggested so far sounds reasonable enough. If someone creates a product and they infuse it with their own creativity, aren't they justified in expecting to be paid for it?
Well, they certainly are, but we think that the motion picture industry and others are certainly adequately compensated by this product because this product does several things. If it only built home libraries to put away and to use just for even personal use, let alone commercially, which it does not. But that is not the case. The video cassette recorder does three things. It makes home movies with your own camera, and that we are going to film away from tape, tape away from film very quickly. But it also plays pre-recorded cassettes. Some 35,000 titles are now available, 4,000 movies. Only 90 movies were available 4 years ago. And there is a time-shifting use for it. It means that those that work at night, those that work at day, can enjoy programs when they wish to. And those royalties have been paid because the rating services check those sets, VCRs, as if they were television sets, and they compensate the motion picture companies or anyone that originates programs. So that building libraries just doesn't happen in only about 5% of the case of the use of the VCR.
Well, but it can happen. I mean, you must acknowledge that technically there is the possibility that people can tape whatever they want and keep it for as long as they want.
Yes, but technology is leapfrogged. It's not economically feasible to tape off the air with commercials. Let's say a movie that was on this last week, very popular show. You could tape it, and yet you'd have commercials. You might have a fuzzy picture off your set if you don't have a good antenna, and it's probably been censored. It would be so much easier to go out and rent for $5 that same movie, or to buy a video disc, for instance, and enjoy it in that fashion. And people do not save movies or programs as they do Beethoven's Fifth, the Barbra Streisand record, for instance. They keep forever.
All right, what about that, Mr. Wayman? I mean, Mr. Scheinberg?
Well, I think we've heard a lot of nonsense here. As far as we're concerned, if somebody tapes a program, even if he chooses to see it later, he is depriving us of a legitimate opportunity, A, to have him as part of our audience on another showing of the program for which we're to be compensated. B, he's certainly depriving us of an opportunity to sell him a tape. But the most important thing of all is that I take great umbrage, and quite frankly, I'm offended at anybody telling us that we've been paid enough. Our notion of our society, at least it used to be such, was that if you owned a property, you had the right to control its destiny. And I frankly don't want the Japanese manufacturers telling us that we've already made enough money.
Mr. Scheinberg, perhaps the easiest example for us, though, to understand is if we are at home listening to our radio and I take my Sony audio tape recorder and I record a record, am I now infringing upon anyone's rights?
I don't know. The law has apparently not disposed of that question.
But I mean, under this, well, let me take it to our legal expert, Mr. Nimmer. Is that a parallel case?
It arguably is distinguishable. In 1971, Congress, when they amended the Copyright Act at that time, had a committee report in which they said audio taping was fair use, not infringement. Now, and they clearly did not speak of videotaping at that time. It is ambiguous whether, under the new law, that committee report is applicable with respect to audio tape. It's not a clear question at this point.
All right, gentlemen, I'm afraid ambiguity is where we're going to have to leave this issue.